Okay, so today we're going to move into color for the first time. I'm going to turn my fan down. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Although we're going to move into color slowly. I usually like to work on to do color slowly. Give me 1 second, sorry. So the other thing I just want to let people know, I've ordered better equipment. So I ordered a new webcam that I'll use to do my demos. That was supposed to arrive yesterday. It did not. I assume it's going to arrive today. So today, I think the way I'm going to have to solve the problem we were running into last week is I'm going to have to do the video at a lower resolution. So I was filming the video at 1080 resolution. I'm just going to have to film it at 720. I think my phone will be able to handle that. But the resolution on the video for today will not be as good as it has been previously. I'm almost positive that the new webcam will solve that problem. So I think people did a great job on their still lives. I don't always remember immediately whose each one is. Whose is this?
It's mine, Allison's.
Allison, okay. Yeah, I think you did a really nice job. So I think that the sense of form on this orange is very good. And I think everybody can see that. I think that not only did you make a nice sense of the volume moving around the form by using those elements of light and shadow, but you also created a good sense of the form rolling over the top. So I have a sense that the stem of the orange is on the top plane of that orange. I think you saw that really well. So one thing that you did miss, and this was common in everybody's, not everybody, but several people missed this in their still lives, was the value relationships. So you did a good job seeing, I think, color temperature for the background, color temperature for the orange. I think that the color temperature given your setup for the tabletop should have been roughly the same as the background. I'm not totally sure why you saw it as such a different color temperature. So that's just something to be aware of. The other thing to keep in mind, so as we move forward in the class throughout the semester, I'd like people to try to keep in mind, what we learn with each assignment and bring that forward into the next assignment, even though we're going to be adding information. So what I mean by that here is if you look at the value relationship between your orange and the table it's sitting on, your orange is darker than the table. But if you look at the value relationship here, the value of the orange is much lighter than the value of the table. And so you want to be careful of that. You want to not only get color temperature, but you also want to somehow communicate those value distinctions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Allison, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but that was very common. Sometimes it's hard to hold on to those, to those concepts we learn in one class and then bring them forward to the next. Part of the reason that's important is in a way, whose is this? Is this Hans?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I'm not sure this is going to be clear when I say this, but when you're painting something, let's say like a tomato, like Hong is painting here, in a way to make as convincing a painting of this tomato as possible, you don't want to be thinking that you're painting a tomato. All you want to be conscious of is painting relationships of value and color. So when I'm painting this, I don't want to be thinking tomato. Instead, I want to be thinking value relationship between here and here, value relationship between here and here, color relationship between here and here, here and here. I want to be just thinking about value and color relationships. That's really what painting is. You don't want to think too much, okay, I'm going to paint a tomato, because then you focus on just looking at that thing itself. If we're painting this and thinking about tomato, we sort of forget that we're also painting everything around it. And we just focus on this thing itself and stop looking at the way we only see this tomato, because we're seeing a network of color and value relationships. So the same thing, I think that it's a strong painting in many ways. I like the way you're starting to see the value progression around the object. And I think you did a good job seeing color temperature. So warm, cool, warm. That's true in your painting, warm, cool, warm. But like in Allison's painting, you didn't quite see value relationships. So what's lighter or darker? Is the tomato lighter or darker than the tabletop? In your painting, the tomato's clearly lighter than the tabletop. But here, really, the tomato is darker than the tabletop. Here, the shadow mass is darker than the tabletop behind it. In your painting, the shadow mass overall is darker. That's true. This here is darker than this. But I think that this reflected light is a little overstated. So it's something everybody should bear that in mind going forward. We do want to be thinking about temperature relationships and color relationships, but we don't want to lose sight of the value relationships. Those remain as important. Whose painting is this again?
Mine.
Callus, okay. Again, a really, really strong in the way you're seeing the progression of value. I think you're starting to get that really nicely. And in your painting, I think temperature and value relationships, I think, are pretty good. Maybe in the future, try to eliminate the contour so that you're really working, just color mass against color mass. But I think in your painting, the temperature and value relationships are good. I think maybe, it's sometimes a little hard to tell from a photograph, but I think maybe your values and the shadows are getting a little bit washed out. So I would bear that in mind. I think maybe the values could have been a little bit darker and maybe even a little bit warmer. Although I know that it gets a little bit challenging if you're when you're trying to paint, the shadow on a lemon when all you have is that red color. But I do think these maybe could have been a little warmer. But overall, I think good, very good progress. Remind me whose this is?
It's mine, Lisa.
Lisa, okay. So again, I'm very happy to see people dealing, really working hard to deal with the progression of light and shadow, which is obviously a very important part of making these paintings work. I think that's working really well. I think that the temperature relationships are good, and I like the way you used that red paint to suggest, you started to suggest a real color difference, even though you're using the same color to get these two different areas. I think that works really well. So one thing to be careful of going forward, or to really pay attention to, is notice in your painting how the value near the top edge of the object, in your painting, it's about the same value as the background. With the exception of this little halo of dark, where in your setup, clearly the value on the top of the object was considerably lighter than the value behind. So that's something to try to bear in mind. Like, I think that you could have painted the lemon with this value here all the way up to the top of the lemon. And then that would have helped you suggest that value difference. So those value differences are really important. So I would, again, for everybody, I think that's something everybody struggled with, holding on to that consciousness of value difference as you move forward. So I would just bear that in mind. It's going to be a really important thing as our paintings get more and more complex. So Lisa, I would also just see if you can, in future paintings, a little bit more carefully work in the progression of values across the form, or the progression of light and shadow across the form. So I'm much more conscious of a reflected light in a core of the shadow here than I'm getting in your painting. There's also something to look at, is the way the halftone, we could think of two halftones here. One, a halftone that creates that softness at the edge. And then there's a halftone plane here. So this entire plane, almost like a sash on a dress or a tuxedo, there's this halftone plane that I think maybe could just be a little bit better articulated in the painting. So just something to bear in mind going forward. So nice painting. Is this Sarwaz?
Yes, Professor.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the painting. I think it's a strong painting. It's a little hard to tell in photographs, but it looks to me like, if we're going to be sort of nitpicking in terms of color temperature, this looks really blue compared to this, where there definitely should be a temperature difference from here to here, but this looks a little bit too blue. Do you see that?
Yes.
I mean, I will acknowledge that sometimes photographs don't totally capture the color. but maybe, but if it's true in your painting, I would just be aware of that. You know, this could have been a little bit warmer, right? Not that warm, but a little bit warmer.
Yeah. So I used the black and white, but like looking at the picture now, it looks a lot bluer right now.
Yeah, I mean, so what I think what I would have done was use the black and white, but then just put a little bit of red in it.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, again, and this could be the photograph, and I should say that about everybody's. You know, I have to be conscious of the fact that I'm looking at photographs which can, you know, which don't always present the best color. But just based on these two photographs, this cast shadow looks very cold in your painting, where here it's pretty warm. Do you see that?
Yes.
So I would just, and this is for everybody, I would really look at the temperature and the color of shadows. Sometimes we tend to just expect them to be dark and cold. That's just the kind of unquestioned bias we have about shadow color. I think because we think about shadows or shade as cool, you know, relative to, let's say, the heat of the sun. So we have this kind of unexamined bias that the color of shadows is going to be cold or cool, but it's often very warm because there's no direct light getting in there, but there's a lot of warm light bouncing in, which is certainly the case here. So there's going to be warm light bouncing in from the warmth of the cardboard box. And then there's going to be light bouncing off the cardboard box, hitting the orange, and then bouncing back here. So you're going to get a lot of warm color bouncing in there. So I would just be aware of that. I do think your shadows could have been darker, Sarwa. Do you see how these get a little bit bleached out? Where these shadows are much more saturated?
Yeah, like I try to make it a lighter than the background. I think I made the background a little too dark, so that's why I didn't want to like mix it up too much.
Yeah, the background's a little bit too dark. It's true, but overall, a nice painting. Fatima, I didn't have time to upload your still life. I mean your pear. I'll do that next time.
Okay.
So, I mean, just because you only sent it this morning, I'm just trying to remember to send them both at the same time. So, but I do, just remembering looking at the photograph, you were painting a green pear.
Yes.
On a white surface.
Yeah.
That means that the value of the pear was darker than the value.
So this is, yeah, on the left side it's light, then in the between it's like a shadow, then it's like core shadow on the right side.
But that's not what I'm referring to. In your,
Okay.
you were painting a green pear. So the value of the light side was much darker than the paper that the pear was on. So this should be darker than this.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean? Because you were painting green on white. So this should have been, so you want to pay careful attention to that. It's just the same thing that several people also missed, because I think it's very common to sort of forget that we want to still be looking at value. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And then I think that the painting still needs more warmth. So the cast shadow would have had some warmth in it. So I would try to look a little bit more for those variations in color temperature next time. Is this Ikra's?
Oh, no, that's not mine.
Whose is this again?
Mine, Diana.
Diana, I'm sorry. I think it's good, looks good. I think your paintings are coming along really nicely. I think your values look good. I think at least the value relationships, that maybe that gets a little bit light there, but dark to light. In fact, this is a little bit lighter than this, which is good.
Blending is like really hard for me.
Have you been able to get a dry brush?
I did, but okay, so I went to Michael's and I got like the fan one, and I think that's kind of helped me blend it a little bit better where it's like with the strokes, but I didn't find the brush that you sent me because I guess that one's from Dick Blick. The one that you sent out to everybody. So I didn't have anybody to talk to there to ask them what would be similar to that.
Yeah, that's the problem with Michael's, that you don't, there's not often good communication with staff. You could get some brush like that, something that approximates that. A fan brush is good, but a fan brush better for like big flat areas.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can try to get a brush like that, or just order it from Blick if that's possible.
Yeah.
One thing I would be careful of is try not to overstate reflections or small variations within the larger masses. Like this value here really pops out to me. Like in the sense that I don't know what's happening when I look at your painting. I do see something here, which I'm sure is what you were looking at. I'm not sure what that is. Do you remember if that was a reflection or was that like a little bump that turns towards the light?
I think it's a little bump that turns towards the light. Okay. So I was getting confused as to like whether or not I should like draw that in or paint that in or like leave it, because it is lighter when you look at it. Okay,
so I would say, this is true for an artist at any level. One, there's no reason not to paint it if you like that, if you like that detail. But when you choose a detail to paint, you want to make it totally convincing for the viewer when they're looking at it. So what I mean by that, in your painting, I can't quite tell the difference between this and this, right? Where this is a reflection. And so when you're painting a little bump in the form, so where the form is turned into shadow, but then there's a small plane that peeks out towards the shadow again. It's almost like a little ledge on a mountainside. You want to make sure that reads as a little ledge on the form, or a little bump on the form. And the way that happens actually is you want to treat that light, this area here, that little light form, exactly the way you treat this light form. So in other words, there's going to be a light side, and then the shadow side starts here. There's going to be a little bit of a softness on that edge. There's probably going to be a little subtle core of the shadow. Like this is a light plane turning into a shadow plane, just like this, light plane into shadow plane. So that little light plane is going to have all those characteristics of light and shadow, just like this one. So when you paint it that way, that's going to then appear different from this reflection, which I actually think could be a little bit more softly blended into the shadow. Do you see that? Do you see that, Diana?
Yeah, you broke up a little bit. You said it's a little bit, it needs to be.
I think this could be.
I didn't hear you.
This could be blended into the shadow a little bit better.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, that was like definitely one of my major issues is blending in. So I need to get that brush, I think.
Yeah, try to get that brush. You can also, it's possible to blend with a brush you're using for painting anyway.
I tried to use one of the other brushes, the other filbert brushes,
Yeah.
the slightly bigger one. But I don't know, it started to get messy, and then I had to go back in with the color. And I remembered you telling us to like to blend like on the actual canvas rather than on the paper, so that the color mixes better, I guess,
Well,
because it's
the other thing about blending, and several people have asked me this, have asked me about blending. Blending is one of those things that really the only way, there's nothing I can suggest things to get. Like I can suggest certain kinds of dry brushes to get. It is possible to blend with a brush you're using to paint. Like you can clean it out and really dry it off. It's never quite as good as a dry brush. The thing is though, blending is just a skill. So it really just takes practice. It's really just the type of thing that you need to know you want to do it and just keep practicing. I mean, I will show, today I will show again some techniques for blending, because people have asked a lot about it. But it is one of those things that just comes with practice. One thing that is not quite working in the drawing of your apple is this contour here. And this is something that everybody should pay attention to, because this is an important aspect of drawing organic objects. So on your apple, you have what I would refer to as a concavity. Do you know what I mean by that? A concave line?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this old rule in figure drawing, but it applies to all organic objects, which is that there's no such thing as a concave line in nature. So if you look at that line that you were drawing on the apple, notice how it's made up out of two convex lines. One convex line here that intersects with another convex line. And we actually don't see a concavity anywhere. We just see an overlap of two convex lines. So this would have been more convincingly drawn if the line had come down like this and was a full convexity. And then this line had been a convexity that overlaps that. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So the reason for that is organic objects, almost without exception, maybe I can say without exception, are objects where the form is created from inside. And so the form we see is internal structure pushing out on an outer membrane. And so because of that pushing out from within, you always see the contour created by a series of convex as opposed to concave lines. So I would just bear that in mind.
By organic things, you meant like organic things like bodies or fruits, vegetables, things
anything
that
alive.
are alive.
Yeah.
Wow,
Not
okay.
organic in the sense we hear today, like in terms of food. Organic just means living organisms.
Yeah.
So anything organic. So like a tree, fruit, anything. I find that to be virtually always true.
That's such a perception, such a sharp perception.
Whose is this?
This is Selena. Professor, I send you the new one also. I think, but this one is the better.
Okay. So Selena, you also asked about blending.
Yeah.
And I'll talk about that. I mean, it looks like you're starting to do it. Places in this painting where there could be, I think, blending that's a little bit more, I feel like that cast shadow must have had some softness at the edge. So there's a little bit of softness, right? Do you see that?
Yeah, I did the other one. I sent it.
Okay. All right, yeah, I just didn't have time to upload anything that came in this morning. So, I think the way you're seeing the mid-tone, shadow, I think you're doing a good job with that. What I just talked about with Diana's painting, you want to be careful of these concave lines, or like I think that would be better described with a fuller convexity overlapping with that convexity. So there's a nice sense of, a good sense of the full volume of the object, a good sense of the space around it. I would, for you too, Selena, I would be a little bit careful of value relationships. So here we can see, given the apple you chose, it's clearly darker than the table. Where in your painting, the apple and the table are around the same value. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So I'd just be careful of that. But I think your color temperature is good, warm to cool, warm to cool. I think that works well. It looks like you got you started to find the warmth of the cast shadow, so that's good. So I think it looks good.
Thank you.
Melody, I think you did a really nice job. Really nice sense of the full roundness of the object. Very strong. A nice sense of, a very believable shadow mass and a nice softening of that edge. I also have a nice sense of planes, of one plane facing the light, the turning away of the other plane, a nice sense of the top planes. I think you did a really nice job on all that.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Because I remember you said in last class, you said halftone is normally, is often warmer than shadow. And in your demo, your pair, the halftone is cooler than shadow and light.
The halftone is what?
It's cooler. It's cooler than your shadow.
If I said that the halftone was warmer, then I misspoke. Usually the halftone is cooler.
Oh, okay.
Not always, but usually. So if I may have said warmer. Sometimes I do that. I get the words wrong. But what I should have said is that, and I apologize for that because I know how confusing that could be. Usually the halftone is cooler.
Okay.
Okay. Like often halftones, and getting back to Devorah's question last week about the cast shadows, I personally don't know the exact physics of light that account for this, but almost always halftones are cool. They have a kind of bluish cast to them. So that's just based on both a kind of common painter's knowledge, but also just observation, empirical observation. But that's what I should have said, so I apologize for that.
Okay, got it.
So somebody, I forget, I want to upload, I just want to upload anybody who didn't. This is eQuiz, right? I didn't talk about this, did I?
Yeah, that's fine. And no, you didn't talk about it yet.
Oh, I did upload it. Wait, what did I do? So just give me a second to upload these last few. This is yours, Kevin.
My name is pronounced Keith, and yes, that's mine.
Keith. I'm sorry, Keith?
Yes, Keith.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Don't worry about it.
I think it's a nice, what do you feel like you struggled with?
Just the like doing the light part. Yeah, like what do you call it? Yeah, kind of like on the upper left, like where it's supposed to be light, where the light is sitting in. That's why I feel like I struggled on.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll look at it more intensively in just a second.
Okay.
All right, just looking for the last one. So, whose is this? Whose painting is this?
That's mine, Professor Lena.
Which is the salvation of the soul. And karma dictates how fast or slow.
Oh, is this your painting here?
It's not a sprint.
Is someone's audio on?
Do you see your painting, Lena? On my desktop?
I don't see a painting. I see a gray screen. I don't know. I see a few thumbnails on the desktop, but I'm not sure if I see mine.
Yeah, I didn't download it. My color looks really off, doesn't it?
Yeah, I didn't have the red oxide yet. I told you on Friday that I was hoping to have it through the weekend, have it delivered, but I didn't get it. So the color, I tried to I actually had an acrylic one that was, sorry, so I tried to color match, but it didn't come out as great.
You did this in acrylic?
No. I tried to match it with an acrylic one that I had that was red oxide. So I just try to do a color matching,
But so you did use black, white, and a
right, yeah, I did.
And a red color.
Right. It was kind of I mixed a little of burnt sienna with a little of the crimson.
Yeah, that's okay. That's fine. Is this color better?
Yeah.
Yeah, because the one you sent looks very purple.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Okay, so what's the last one? Fatima, are you back in? Fatima, are you back in? So I think it's a nice painting, Ikra. I mean, did you want these broken strokes here?
No, so I don't have the mineral spirits yet. I thought I had it at home, but it was acetone, and so I still have to get that. So it's just been hard for me to kind of blend because, like, I tried using water, but then obviously that didn't help because it's oil paint. And this was for the first painting where I used water a little bit, but for this one I didn't. It was hard to like blend, I guess. That's why it looks like that, but I wanted it to kind of look like one color.
How are you cleaning your brushes?
I'm just using water. And then I'm using like a rag to kind of take the paint off.
Okay. You mean, are you using soap and water every day?
No, just water.
Because your brushes are going to dry out and not be usable anymore unless you clean them with soap and water. Be careful of that.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to get mineral spirits. There's no way to work with oil paints without it.
Yeah, my brother's on his way to get it right now.
I mean, you don't have to have it to mix the paint. Like you could blend this.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have any, you didn't accidentally buy any acrylics, did you?
No, this is all from Blick from what you told us to get.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because, I talk a lot about blending. But if someone doesn't want to blend their colors, you don't have to. And some artists say you should never blend your colors. I think that's nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't have to blend them. So if someone's more interested in a kind of like broken mark making, that's totally fine. I guess I just want to say that this is broken mark making, though, should be a little bit more controlled. So, if anyone's interested in that, we can talk about the way to do that. So I just want to put that out there. I do, but I think the way you're seeing light and shadow, I think is good. I think the way you're trying to find planes, I think you're doing a good job with that. That seems strong to me. You have a nice sense of light, dark, reflected light, core of the shadow. That's all very good. It's a little hard for me to see the value relationships. I suspect this should have been darker than the ground plane because that's such a dark apple.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a little hard for me to say. What is the light you're using?
It was, I don't have the shop light, so I just used the regular.
Okay, so where is the light?
I don't know if I have. I didn't send a photo of just the apple. I can go take a photo right now and send it to you.
No, you don't have to. I'm just asking, where is the light that you're using in the room?
Oh, it's just recessed lights on the ceiling.
Okay, so that's fine. I mean, that, if that works, look, you have a sense of, you have light and shadow on the apple, and I can see here that there's a cast shadow, and it looks like there's just one light source. So if you can make that work, that's fine. It's an overhead recessed light, and that's true for anybody. If you can make it work, an existing light, that's totally fine. and look, it looks like you have a kind of a nice workstation. And the advantage, that actually has some advantages, because the light on the still life and the light on your painting is the same. And that can be a good advantage. So it looks like the place you're working is good. Keep that light situation. One thing I would do, Ikra, is I would cut this flap off, because it looks like that's blocking more light than you want. I would cut that flap off so that the overhead light can come in a little bit more. Okay, so this top flap here.
Okay.
Okay. But, I think in a lot of ways, I think it's a strong painting.
Thank you.
I would pay careful attention of those value relationships. So someone's having trouble getting in, so I'm just gonna try to. Fatima, can you hear us? I'm texting Fatima just to see what's going on.
Professor, I don't know if it's me, but I feel like your internet is a little bit choppy. I don't know if anybody else is hearing it like that.
Are people hearing me? Are people hearing me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, I hear you well.
I've been hearing you fine also.
Sorry
I
about
guess
that.
then it's mine, although mine says it's like, it's not yours. I guess it's mine, but I don't understand, because mine says it's like, it's reading just like yours is, like the internet's fine. But I don't know.
And I actually hear your audio skipping a little bit sometimes.
Yeah. So it must be something wrong with mine. I just don't know why, because it's full.
Yeah, I mean, there's always some technical glitch it seems like with Zoom. I apologize.
It's not yours. It's definitely mine, because everybody says that they hear my audio pausing. Does my audio sound like it's pausing now?
Well, I'm hearing you fine.
Oh, okay.
It's pretty good. It's really subtle. It's like every now and then it'll kind of like almost like digitize your voice a little bit. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, that's what I'm getting from
mine
him.
or Diana's?
Diana's.
Oh, okay.
But it's just like you're still very much understandable. It's just a little bit like.
It's when you guys talk to me, I get that same feedback. So I don't know. So sometimes, like, that's why I had to have you repeat before, Professor, because I couldn't really like hear.
So
but it's my internet, I guess.
So Keeve, I think one thing you did well was to find or to start to carve out the halftones as planes. So in other words, like, so I read a plane moving in one direction, a plane moving in a different direction, planes rolling around the form. The problem is that, if we consider it a problem, is that I think that the value relationships are overstated. So in other words, so that just needs to be a lighter value.
Okay.
So, you know, the next time, step back, you know, compare the object to what you're painting and ask yourself, like, can one value be lighter or darker? You know, what needs to change? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense.
The other thing, it looks to me like you combined, so the shadow pattern I think is thinner. It looks to me like you combined the shadow pattern with this smaller plane of halftone.
Yeah.
So I would just, so I think that this halftone should have come down like this,
Okay.
popped up a little bit, you know, so there should have been a kind of like little peninsula of halftone down here. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like it should have been thinner, like
Yeah.
the darker, it should have been a thinner one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
But the planar structure is good, and that's an important thing to get. It looks to me like the color on this photograph is off, but values are good, light, dark, that's good. So I think in a lot of ways it's a strong painting.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. This is Lena's, right?
Right, that's mine.
So yeah, I mean, again, you know, this may be dark. I don't know. It looks a little bit like this looks, just in terms of value, this looks a little bit too dark compared to that. You know, in your painting, this, like when I look at this photo, again, as much as I can tell from the photo, that's certainly darker than this, but it also kind of glows with a sort of warm light. And I think that, you know, this probably should have been a little bit lighter and a little bit warmer. Do you see that?
Yeah, I totally see that.
You know, it looks like you left out that surface variation where the red skin turns green. That's fine. You got a nice sense of the volume of the apple. And several people did a really good job with this, getting the roundness of the form, which is strong, like the roundness going around, like the equator of the form, if we can put it that way. But you also have a nice sense of the top plane, you know, like that sort of top table-like plane of the object, which is, you know, which is difficult to do, and I'm glad you saw that. So, you know, related to the color of your background, and this happened with a lot of people's paintings. Again, insofar as we can tell from this photograph, if you look at that shadow has just it's dark, and so you saw that, but it kind of glows. You know, it needs to stay dark, but there probably could have been a little bit more warmth, and it could have been a little bit lighter. Do you see that?
Yeah. It's like my version is definitely darker than what I was actually perceiving. So I see what you're talking about.
Yeah, and people should try to remember, as a kind of guide for when you're painting, is that in general shadows are dark, but they're rich in color, in part because there's very little light in them, right? Because we're not getting a high value. And so you want to find the richness of color in shadows, you know, even when we're working with this limited palette. So in this case, we would want to find a richness of the warm temperature. So people did a really good job. So we'll keep moving forward. I'm pleased to see all these paintings. Let's take I'd like to take just like a 5-minute break before moving on to today's lesson and demo. I'm going to take another break later. I just need to take a 5-minute break after talking for the past hour. So let's do a short break. Okay, 5 minutes, and then we'll come back. So we'll come back. We'll start again at 10:05. at 10:14.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so yeah, so we've started working with color just in the sense that we started working with Venetian transparent red oxide, and really sometimes you hear that black is not a color, that black is the absence of color, but that's really true more when you're talking about the physics of light or optics. Black for an artist functions like a color. And we saw that in the painting we did. Like we could make black appear to be a kind of blue. And there are blacks that have a significant amount of blue pigment in them. So they function as a kind of blue. So what I wanted to do, or what I try to do in my painting classes, is start with value. So do a painting where we just look at value relationships. Then do a painting where we sort of stick our toe in color by working with warm and cool. So we used transparent red oxide, which is, when it comes out of the tube, is darker than this. But if you put a little bit of white into it, you get a color similar to this. And now we're going to, in a sense, add one color to the three colors we're already using. So we're using these three colors, right? We're using white, earth red in the form of transparent red oxide, and ivory black. So we're going to add one color to that. We're going to add yellow ochre. And that's going to give us our first color triad. So a color triad, meaning a set of primary colors. So this is sometimes referred to as the color triad: red, blue, and yellow. So we're going to be using a version of that: yellow ochre, earth red, so these are both earth colors, and then black as a kind of blue. Now, I want to complicate that a little bit. This is traditionally called either the dead palette, or it's called the Spanish palette sometimes, and I'll talk about why. But this palette is sometimes used by artists. These are the only colors they use. Now, when artists do that, the black they use is more of a blue black than the black we have. So the black they use is often a black mixed with about 50% blue. And the blue that is mixed with it is ultramarine blue. So that's the color they're using, is either called blue black or Payne's gray, it's sometimes called. I used to teach just with this palette at this stage of the semester. I decided that that actually just caused more confusion than was necessary. So I just separated the blue black, and we're going to add blue to the palette. So I'm still calling this a dead palette painting, or a Spanish palette painting. So I have some hesitation about teaching this way. And the only reason I point that out is I want to make clear why I choose to do color this way. Because when we're using colors in this very incremental way, I think something that can potentially be confusing for students is it's nearly impossible to mix a lot of colors with just these, or it's impossible to mix a lot of colors with just these. So, sometimes my impulse is to just go right into a fuller palette. But I find that that has some confusing things about it too. And I also find that by working with a dead palette or a Spanish palette, students will learn what you can do with these colors. And if you just go right into a full palette, it's confusing because there are so many hues that you have to deal with. And you never really learn sort of slowly what these more limited colors can do. So at least as of now, I think that it's a good idea to go very slowly into color. So starting with black and white, just studying value, adding red or an earth red, so we study warm and cool in addition to value. And then going into this traditional palette, again, dead palette or Spanish palette, as a way of seeing what the possibilities are with this limited palette. Now, the reason this is called Spanish palette is because this palette is associated with very famous Spanish painters. So I don't know if people know of Diego Velázquez, 17th century Spanish painter, a very famous painter, but also a painter who was adored by many artists. This is a painting of his that's at the Met. This is a very famous painting by Velázquez called Las Meninas. And so when looking at these two paintings, I think you can probably see that these are very limited color spectrum, right? When we first look at them, we don't think to ourselves, or at least I don't think we do, we don't say to ourselves, well, this is done with a very limited range of colors. The colors in these paintings don't adequately communicate to us the colors we see in the world. I mean, I think that the artists have used those colors so effectively that we just believe the painting we're looking at. But if you look at the colors, if you start to analyze them, really all of these colors can be achieved with that very limited palette. And I mentioned that we can think of this limited palette as a kind of set of primaries, red, yellow, blue. This is black, but we can use blue as a black. I mean, we can use black as a blue, which you can do. So notice that Velázquez has done that. He's got these greenish colors, these kind of olive green colors by mixing black and yellow ochre and then adding a little white to it. So these colors of the flesh are all achieved with earth red, white, and yellow ochre. The darks are created by using black with a warm color mixed in. And that's the same here. So just before moving on, what could be an advantage, or can anyone think of an advantage for an artist to using a limited palette? Like, why would an artist potentially choose that, and what would an advantage be?
Maybe less like mixing of it's easier because you only have like the 4 colors and you can mix them and make more colors rather than having like a whole thing of, I don't know, it's less messy. I want to say, I don't know how to describe that, but that's what I'm thinking. Like,
I think that's part of it. It's more efficient.
Yeah.
There's an efficiency to that.
I wonder if it could be easier to keep a consistent like mood or tone throughout a painting when you have a more limited palette.
Yeah, I think that's the primary reason an artist would choose a limited palette, because the limited palette almost ensures a kind of unity, a kind of unity of color, as you said, a kind of unity of mood. You're able to achieve that, or it encourages a kind of unity in a painting, which isn't to say that that in itself, makes it a requirement that any artist use a limited palette. But I think that's something that some artists like about it. And, I think it's worth struggling with a limited palette to see that as a potential way of working. And so Velázquez paintings, for example, let's see, you know, they certainly have that quality to them, that kind of unity, that color and mood unity to the painting. So like I said, we can use these colors, and we're going to be including blue. And so we can think of these as our versions of the primaries at this stage. And I'd like people to start thinking about primaries and how we use them to mix a range of other colors. So I just wanted to point out another option, not exactly an option that we're going to be investigating, but again, artists have throughout the centuries deliberately used limited palettes. So this is a kind of famous limited palette by a Swedish painter. He's actually not that well known, except to a certain subset of artists. But he's associated with a palette that goes by his name. His name was Anders Zorn, Z-O-R-N. And he used a version of that Spanish palette. He used black, yellow ochre, and vermilion, so relatively intense red. So these are all options, certainly. And you can see in his paintings, again, I think it's clear that you can see this painting was done with just vermilion, black, and then yellow ochre, right, in the yellows. Now, one thing I always want to point out, this is also a Zorn painting. Clearly, he did not use his Zorn palette for this, right? Because there's no way you're going to get that rich, vibrant green by mixing black and yellow ochre. That's the only way to get green with this palette, black and yellow ochre. And what you end up with is that kind of olive green. So there's no way you're going to get these. So even artists who are well known for using limited palette, they deviate from that when necessary. So I just want to point that out. I think that's important to emphasize. Okay. So by the way, Zorn is an example of an artist who really doesn't blend, right? Like Zorn lets all of his strokes, they exist as strokes. He doesn't try to make them disappear. And if you were to look closer at this painting, all of these leaves are just little strokes of paint. So that's what I was referring to. I mean, I blend my paintings, but you don't have to do that. If you want to work in a more broken way, that's totally fine. Like Zorn is working in this broken way. Velázquez famously did that. These artists are still looking at light mass, shadow mass, reflected light, and so on. But you can certainly work in a broken way if that's something that you're interested in. There's some blending in these artists' work, but it's largely a broken way of constructing the form. This painting, by the way, is at the Met in New York. So when it reopens, I've heard in August, if people feel comfortable, it's well worth seeing this painting. And I do want to encourage people who are interested in continuing with painting beyond this class. I think everybody knows this, but I think it's worth emphasizing that there really is one of the best collections of art in the world in New York City. So it's a great way to keep learning is by looking at as much art as possible. So let me see. Okay, so I'm gonna share my phone and then we'll go in to today's demo talking about color. Okay, so the color the palette we're going to be using today is, we're going to use our white. And our black, just as we started with. We're going to be using our transparent red oxide. And just to make the color a little bit more clear, so we're thinking about that as a kind of red. Because it is a red. And then we're going to add now to our palette yellow ochre, and ultramarine blue. And again, this is a palette that many artists have used, just this limited palette. And you can, as we sort of talked about, you can get a very beautiful, very rich range of colors, even if you can't match every color you may be looking at. And palettes, I mean, paintings that are made with this palette often have, so just to emphasize that blue, often have a kind of beautiful, pearly, subtle color range. So it's something, it's a range of colors that can be very beautiful in its own way. So I did send everybody a photograph of the still life I'm going to be working from. And I'm just going to turn turn the screen around so you see the still life. So I just want to point out that I'm going to be working today just using the window lights. So the window lights coming in from the left, obviously, so we still have light side, shadow side, light side, shadow side. And I just want to use that because I don't want people to think that the only kind of light you can use is that harsh raking light that we get from the clip-on lights. That kind of light is very useful because it makes very clear the light and dark situation we're dealing with. But there are advantages to using other kind of light situations too. So there's a kind of subtlety to using something like indirect daylight. So again, I can use the window light because I have a north light studio. So the light stays the same all day long. So if you have a window where direct sunlight comes in, you can't really use that. But I'm going to be working with this light just to emphasize, that it is possible to work with different light options as long as you're clearly thinking about light masses, dark masses, and constructing the painting along those lines. So I hope everyone has this, has that image that you can refer to, that photograph. And I'm going to draw very quickly because I don't want to waste a lot of time on the drawing. I won't spend all the time I've spent on drawing that I did on previous days. I will just say that I'm taking the same approach to drawing I took before. An approach to drawing that I highly recommend, especially when you're first starting to draw. I do want to emphasize that I don't think it's a way. Go ahead. Oh.
Rose.
Oh, okay, I know why it froze. Ah. I wasn't recording. Okay. I'm recording now. So, you know, I will say that I don't think that artists need to draw this way always, but I think it really helps, especially a beginner, understand certain important things about establishing the structure of the thing that you're drawing. So looking at and mastering this way of working, I think, is a very useful thing for a young artist to do. How to interpret complex organic form in terms of these simple structural lines that locate certain important key points on the contour. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing with the drapery. So, by the way, for the next painting, I'm going to let people just choose to make a slightly more complex still life. I would recommend 2 objects, at the most 3. So it could be something like this, like an orange and a drapery arranged behind it, where the drapery has a nice series of planes, so light and dark planes, just like this one does. But I'm going to let, you know, I'm going to let people choose. You choose your object for the next still life. We'll be aiming at painting something with a little bit more complexity than we've been doing so far. And hopefully it'll give people a chance to paint something that, you know, maybe it's something that they really love. I would strongly recommend not getting too complicated. You know, I would probably avoid painting something like a silver cup, you know, that kind of thing, because then you're getting into a whole different problem of painting. If you're getting into issue of reflection, and that presents its own problems. I can, if anyone's interested in that, I can address that particular problem of painting reflections or painting glass, if that's something anybody's interested in. But I would probably recommend that you don't do that in this painting. So as I'm drawing the drapery, I'm looking at the form, and the form of the drapery is in a way, like I can think of the form of the drapery as a series of modified geometric forms. So in other words, this form here, this main form on the drapery that comes down just behind the orange. So again, if you look at your image, you should be able to see that. I can think about that form as a kind of box-like structure. Like it has a top plane that's facing the light here, and then it has a side plane, just like a box does. As that shadow moves backwards in space towards the wall of the box. And then at this point here where the shadow ends, that form changes direction and moves this way before we get to another volume on the drapery. And that's another plane that's facing the light source. I don't see all of that. Like this. So if we, I'm going to block in the drapery first, just so that we carry our, or we continue.
Question, Professor.
Yeah, go ahead.
As I'm looking at your picture, the shadow of the, what is that, an orange, I guess? Doesn't it go a little bit higher towards where you drew that? I don't know if it's because of the picture or because you're looking at something different.
Well, I haven't drawn in the shadow pattern on the orange.
Oh, okay, no problem.
That was a line I...
No, I'm talking about, I'm sorry, what is this? The cast shadow.
The cast shadow, okay. So there may be some difference in like the angle of the photograph, but I see the cast shadow as having an angle like this.
Yeah.
And then it rises up as the drapery rises up a little bit. Let's see, and then it comes up like this. I think I'm getting these angles about right. And then the cast shadow, and then like where the cast shadow intersects with the form shadow on the drapery.
Oh, all right, so that's what that is. It's because I couldn't tell. It looks like the cast shadow goes all the way up to almost towards like the top of the orange. Like that's what I see it on mine.
There is a cast shadow here too. Is that there is a little cast shadow there, and then the cast shadow gets interrupted by the form shadow on the drapery.
Oh, okay.
And then there's this, and then the cast shadow's down there. Does that make sense?
Yes. I just wasn't sure if it's because I have the picture side by side. I wasn't sure if it was me or like if I was seeing something wrong.
But since you brought up the shadows, let me. So the form shadow on the orange is much more subtle than it would have been if I had used today the relatively harsh light of the clip-on light and the bulb. Nevertheless, I can clearly make out a shadow. It's just a more subtle shadow. It runs along the right side of the form. Doing something like that. And it's a much, like I would call that shadow color a much richer, it's more chromatic. Chromatic means color that hasn't been grayed out or bleached out by white. So it has a full saturation of color. And that shadow color is very chromatic compared to the relatively dark browner shadow colors that would have been created by the breaking clip-on light. So corrected with this. So on the drapery itself, I want to really emphasize that I don't want, sometimes I see people, they have a drapery and they just kind of start streaking in marks of paint, sort of suggesting the downward pull of the drapery. But I really want to get clearly the sense of this drapery being a series of planes moving in and out of the space. And I'm going to be asking myself, how does the light and shadow show me that that's happening? So I'm going to be really carefully analyzing the form of the drapery and not just kind of randomly blocking in marks that suggest the kind of downward pull but don't really sculpt the form. So I really want to be sculpting the form of that drapery. I'm just correcting my drawing a little bit.
I've got this like thought that perhaps, like I think it would be helpful if you could take a picture of your still life from the perspective from which you're painting it.
Yeah, I did that. I did that as much as possible, but a camera always distorts because a camera just, because of the lens of the camera, it never exactly replicates what the human eye sees. So I did the best I could, especially given like the limitations of an iPhone.
Yeah.
That actually gets into a whole, I think a really interesting discussion about photography and how much it actually reflects the way we see. Because a camera is a depiction of the world as if it's being seen with one eye, where we see the world with two eyes, and then our brain reconciles those two different images. So we actually see things quite differently than a camera does, but we all think that a camera is accurate. Where actually a camera, in many ways, is highly inaccurate, at least if we're really talking about showing us the way we see. So, if I had like a much more powerful camera, I took the photograph from farther away, but the same line of sight, I could better approximate it. But that's the closest I can do. I apologize for that.
No, it's okay.
So, okay. So I have the drawing roughed yet.
I'd actually be exacerbated a little bit because your phone's kind of looking at your canvas at a little bit of an angle so that you can get your palette in frame.
Yeah, I mean, and
that might be part of it also. Another
limitation, yeah. Of
yeah.
this process. I know there's nothing I can do about that, because if I don't do it this way, then my body's going to be blocking the view of the canvas. So
no, it makes sense. It's just like it's just an online thing, I think.
I apologize. Okay, so I'm going to start, as I always do, by blocking in the background, which in this case is primarily the drapery. There's a little bit of a gray piece of paper back there. So I'm going to be using, I'll start with an obvious question. How do we mix green?
The
How
red
do
and
we mix the color green?
Blue and yellow.
Yes.
Blue and yellow. Right, so I'm going to start mixing the background. I mean, the colors of that drapery by mixing yellow, the yellow I have, yellow ochre with green. I mean, yellow ochre with blue. And so what I end up with is a kind of olive. Now that's the limitation of my palette. Now the color of that green drapery is not very vibrant. So I'm actually going to be able to get pretty close to that color. I think you'll be surprised once we get all the colors down. We'll leave that light for now. And then I'm going to mix the shadow color for that. So I'm going to be always working light and shadow masses. So I'm going to take my blue, and I'm going to use the exact same colors. Okay, so here we're going to get into my options for mixing the color of that green. I think the base of both the shadow and the shadow and the light are the same two colors, blue and yellow. So the question is, how do I make the darker color so that it reads as clearly different from the lighter? So if I put more blue in it, the shadow is going to be cooler. But I'm actually not sure I want that. I'm not sure.
Would you say the shadow is
That's
more?
appropriate, because I don't want to make my shadow too cool. I want to mix that color. So that color is a green, or I want to make, we could also say that hue, H-U-E, that's sometimes used as a synonym for color. I want to mix that hue. I want to mix that value. It's a dark value, so I think to myself, I need to put blue in there. But I don't want to put so much blue that the color becomes too cold. So I've mixed this dark. It's a dark green, just using ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. And I'm going to lay that in. So I'm very carefully following the shadow pattern. And on the screen, that looks very, very dark. It doesn't look quite that dark in person. But it looks very dark on the screen, and it looks very dark to me, too. What's causing that to look very dark, like darker than it's actually eventually going to appear? Anybody know, like, why does that look so dark?
It hasn't dried, perhaps.
I'm sorry?
It hasn't dried?
It's next to the white.
It's next to the white. There's so much white around it that by contrast, it looks very dark. So,
once you put the other color in, it won't look as dark.
As dark, that's right. So I was not convinced when I had the color on my palette that color was going to be appropriate. But actually, now that I'm putting it down on my painting and comparing it to what I'm looking at, I think that's actually a pretty good color for the shadows of this drapery. So you can't, you really cannot see it in, what if I can adjust, well, you can see it a little bit. It's a little bit colder on your screen, or at least on my screen, than it is in front of me. But I think this is actually a pretty good, it's both the right value, the right hue, and the right temperature. And that's always what you want to ask yourself. Like when you're judging color, is it the right value? Is it the right hue? And is it the right temperature? And I think I checked those boxes in the case of this. Now, of course, as I've said before, that may change, you know, when I put more colors down. But I think so far I'm doing okay. I don't know how well you can see it in the photograph I sent you, but because of the way the shadow, so that you'll notice that the box is casting a shadow, and that shadow moves across, that cast shadow from the box moves across the drapery here, for example. So there's a cast shadow coming in at an angle like this. And it is, that cast shadow is this form of the drapery. The form of the drapery to the left of this central plane. We call that the central plane of the drapery. Everything to the left of that goes into the cast shadow. So I do see a little bit of variation of light and shadow within the cast shadow. But overall, the left-hand side of the drapery goes into a cast shadow. So for now, I'm just going to block that all in as a dark. I'm not going to I'm not going to too finely indicate the variations of dark and reflected light within that cast shadow. I'm just for now going to block that in as a total dark mass. And then I'll deal with however much information I want within that when I have more of the painting down.
Is this in the interest of time, or would you normally just block the 2 sections off right there?
I'm sorry?
Is this in the interest of time, or would you normally block those
No,
2?
not in the interest of time. This is because, and I don't remember how clearly it shows up in the photograph, but this part of the drapery, so if you look at your photo reference, do you see what I mean by this part of the drapery to the left of that central light plane? Ignore this line, because that was a drawing mistake. So this part of the drapery, that all goes into a cast shadow.
I'm not pointing at anything.
Yeah,
Oh.
what are you?
Oh, sorry, I was pointing at my screen. So this part of the drapery here. So do you see in the photograph how that all goes into a cast shadow?
Oh, yes. Now I see it. Now that you did.
So
Is that the shadow from the box? The box shadow?
it's a shadow from the box. So I
So the line
I want to keep the
is
shadow sort of unified, and I don't want to emphasize the variations within that yet. I will do that, but right now I'm just going to leave that as one shadow area. It's not really for time, it's just because I think that's a better way to deal with the contrast between lights and shadows. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Wait, could you repeat that?
So let me, I'm going to turn my camera around towards the still life again. So now I think now that you can see both. So this area goes all into shadow, and I'm just going to leave that a kind of simple shadow mask for now. What do you think? So the wall to the left of the cast shadow, the wall to the left of the drapery is a gray piece of paper that's in shadow. So there's a kind of warm gray to that. What would you, given our colors that we have, can anyone think about what colors I could use to get that dark, warm gray back here?
Would you add some of the to the already mixed?
Yeah, I'm like maybe the yellow ochre with the black and white, or maybe like Diana's saying, like the green that you already have, maybe just kind of lighten that a bit with a little more white.
Yeah.
And a little yellow ochre.
I think your first option was the best. I think that's a warm gray. And so I think that the best way to get that probably is black and white to get a kind of basic gray. But if I mix black and white together, so I'm going with your first suggestion, and let's break it down into just black and white. So if people can just remember that color, if possible. So I'm going to take white, a little bit of white and black, and I'm going to mix up a gray that's about that value. So that value is a little bit lighter than the green in shadow. So again, thinking about value, I want to make a mixture that's a little bit lighter in value than this green. But that's too cold and blue. Do people see that for that gray? So I think your suggestion to add a little bit of yellow ochre to that is a good one. So I want to warm that shadow up. So I'm going to be mixing a warm gray. And let's try that. Hold on one second, I need to secure that. So I'm gonna block that gray in right up to the green. And I think, let's see.
Wait, I'm confused. Isn't that supposed to be green?
Isn't it supposed to be what?
Green.
Isn't it, I'm sorry, isn't it supposed to be what?
Aren't you making the shadow next to the line, like the green?
This is the gray paper on the back wall of the box.
Oh, okay, because I thought there was still fabric there.
No,
Where
that's
you-
not fabric. That was a mistake line. So we should ignore that line. So the fabric ends right here. So,
Oh, okay, my picture doesn't. Okay, no problem.
so I'm just painting in, and I'm just comparing my painting to what I'm looking at. I think that's pretty good. I may change my mind.
Yeah, I'm a bit confused too. There's like 3 ripples in like the in the drapery. So like where Diana was saying that there's like another ripple right next to like your dark shadow.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean, in my
what I'm going to do, I'm going to.
I think it looked like that kind of slightly lighter third ripple to the left was
Okay,
going
so
to-
this is a really important. You're bringing up a really important point. So what I'm going to do, just so let's clarify that. I'm going to go to. I'm going to pause the recording of the painting. And let's go to the photo I sent to everybody. Let's see, do I have that on my desktop? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so.
I think it was just confusing because of that extra line. Because what I'm understanding now is that you were gonna just lighten that third one on the left.
What is the ripple you're talking about?
Okay, there's that third one all the way to your left. Like we could
This
still see
here?
you could still see the drape all the way down. Especially in my picture, like that picture that you just have, you're pulling up right now, I think is a little darker. Can you check the, oh no, it says it's a copy. That's so weird. How come it comes up so bright in my camera?
Well, it's different. I mean, I can make it lighter.
No,
Just
like
so
how it looks on camera. You could clearly see the line.
I think it's worth addressing this because this is something actually that comes up a lot.
So Professor, do you see what I'm saying right here? There's like you can see the drape.
No. Okay, so
Maybe it's just your, I don't know. Professor?
Yeah.
I was just, I don't know if you can see my screen. I was trying to describe, you see, this is the picture. This is the ripple I think that all of us are talking about. Like we see from top to
I can't
all the
see
way
your
down.
Oh, okay.
Can you see it?
What's the ripple here?
See this one right here, the first line, it goes all the way down. You kind of drew it initially, but then you said, oh, that's a mistake. We could see it in the picture.
What line? Show me again.
The first one.
Yeah, no, that's the line. So that line, so you're talking about this line here, right?
Yeah, this line, yeah.
Yeah, that is this line here. So what is throwing people off?
We can't see what you're pointing to on your painting
Oh,
right now.
Okay, so what I was, okay, so let me, all right, it's getting.
We have the pictures of, like, we have the photographs. So just go, maybe if you go back to the painting.
Okay, so I just want to point something out. I'm, just so everybody knows, you see this slight lightening within the shadow?
Yes.
I'm ignoring that for now. I'm not going to paint any of that.
Okay, no problem.
So I'm ignoring all of the variation in the shadow from this line over to the left.
Okay, that's where we got confused.
Okay,
Yeah.
because this,
We see it as 3 different 1, 2, 3 like bends, folds in the
yes.
in the.
Okay, so but it's really important to remember that when you're starting to block in a painting, you want to be working in terms of only the biggest, most obvious changes of value. And if we look at the difference between this value and this value, that's a big jump. But the difference between this value and this value is minor. So I'm not going to do that yet until I have much bigger values all around it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. Now it makes sense.
Okay, so that's, but that's a really important thing to understand. And it's something that I think people get confused about.
So is that also kind of like a conceptual thing of that like that kind of third bar of lightness we've been talking about? You've decided to consider it as part of, like, as a lightness in the shadow. And so you're like, I'm just going to block this in a shadow and then put some lightness in the shadow later.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm doing. That is a lightness within the shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm doing right now is just blocking in big simplifications of light and shadow. And then once I've done that, then I will go in and put lightnesses in the shadow, lightnesses in the lights, and so on. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah. So you're kind of like going through and just making choices of, I'm going to consider this light and I'm going to consider this shadow, and then lighten parts of the shadow, and I guess highlight
exactly. And the word you used is a good one. Is that a conceptual approach? Yes, in the sense that I'm not just sort of mechanically copying. I'm conceiving of like the big simplified relationships first. So I have the concept of the big relationships in my head first, and I block those in. And then I start going in and asking, what can I add to those big simplifications to make my simplified painting look closer and closer to this more complex visual experience? And the reason you do that is if you try to do every little thing you see at first, you make it much more likely that you're going to be making a whole bunch of little mistakes that in the end don't add up to much. Whereas if you try to simplify things and just get those big simplifications right, it's much easier to do that. And then it's much easier to put small things into those big, accurate simplifications. Does that make sense?
There's a saying that an old painting teacher of mine would say, which was like, be very specific in the generalities, like to make very, very careful choices about like.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Be specific about the generalities. You also hear some painters say always go from big to small. And that's what I'm trying to do here. So, okay. So I'm going to go back to my screen.
I couldn't hear what you just said. Could you please repeat?
I said another thing you hear artists say is always work from big to small masses. Never the opposite. Never go from small masses to big masses. So I'm trying to find like the biggest masses as a first block in, and then I'm gonna, then I'm gonna look for smaller and smaller variations within those big masses.
I have a question about the way you were talking about it also, because you said that you were going to add, like later add lightness to the shadow and then add also highlights to the lights.
Right.
And I have my question is whether, like, is that the choice? Is that what's easier in oil paint? Is it easier to add light upon dark, or is it like specifically as opposed to going into darken a dark later, like instead of like you put out a mid-tone maybe and then you darken the shadow later? Or
Yeah, I do think that's easier. I think it's easier to lighten. I think it's both easier to lighten a dark, and it's easier to make a color more intense from a dull one. So it's easier to lighten a dark and to make a dull color more vibrant than the reverse. I think it's harder to darken something that's too light, and I think it's harder to dull something that's too bright. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm glad I asked that, because that's kind of, I think, an oil paint technique trick that I was wondering about, of like, because there's always that always exists of kind of what's easier to put on top of what's already there effectively.
Yeah, and it's not impossible. It's not impossible to darken a light, but it's just trickier.
Yeah, so it's easier to err on the side of a darker
yes
value or color or duller color, and then
yes. Okay, so by the way, I will have to, since I paused the recording, I will have to again do today's uploaded lecture as two different files. Okay, so but again, I really appreciate people asking that question, because that's a really crucial question to ask. It's something that really confuses people. Making those kinds of decisions about simplifying. So again, just continuing to mix that warm gray. So one thing I will do right away to that, that part of the drapery we were just discussing is I will, one sort of provisional detail or one, just to redraw the edge a little bit, but just at the edge, it definitely gets discernibly darker. So we'll just add that in, just to separate it a little bit from the background. And the drapery has a little bit of a turn to it, so I just wanted to put that in. So one other thing I'm going to add right now, just to give myself a little bit of a, a bit more of a full range of values, is I'm going to put in the occlusion shadow at the bottom of the orange. So I'm going to make that, that's nearly black. It's probably not completely black. So I'm going to take some black and put a little bit of yellow ochre into it and just bring in just that darker, that occlusion shadow. Just so I start to have a full range of values I can work with. I see some of it back here. So making, again, the very dark, just to the left of that central light plane on the drapery.
Professor, we can use any color of fabric, right?
Yeah, you can use any color you want.
Okay.
You don't have to do a drapery, but I think it's an interesting challenge. So here, I am putting in some of that variation within that dark. Okay, so I'm putting in since I started putting in the occlusion shadows, I'm going to paint in some of the dark within that shadow area on the drapery to start to indicate that. Okay. So now I want to there's actually somehow a strange, I don't know what quite explains this. There's a little bit of a shadow here. Or there's a darkening of the light on that. So now I want to bring in the light planes of the drapery. So I have this value here, but this value that I've mixed up is too yellow. Just now that I have this dark down, and I think that dark is a pretty good color. So I'm going to put some more blue into that green that I mixed up, and then I'm going to add white to it. And then that may be too dark. Let's put down a bit more of that. And I'm going to bring that right up to the shadow mass or the shadow plane. And it's just a little too dark. I'm going to lighten that with some white. And so even though this palette is a limited palette, I'm getting pretty close to the green. Now that is not a vibrant green drapery, but still with this limited palette, I'm able to get pretty close to that. And so for now, I can just block in 2 planes of color. And I'm going to mix up more of that. White. It's a little more yellow. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about something similar to what we talked about when we were simplifying this shadow over here. If you notice in the reference photo, if you look from this edge of the shadow all the way across through this deep part of the form.
Very similar, yeah.
I'm sorry?
Very similar.
Similar. I'm going to block this in right now, both this light area and this light area, as just one color. And I just think that it's to separate those two things at this stage in the block-in is just too fine a distinction. And then I'll go in and change the color I have down to suggest the difference I want to create. So I'm just finishing blocking in the totality of the light mass on the drapery. So now, just to get the entire background blocked in, I'm gonna block in the gray of the paper down here, and that's a kind of blue gray. So I'm gonna try just black and white, because it's gray enough. It's bluish, but it's such a grayed down blue that I think just black and white is going to do it. I could be wrong, but I think that's going to be, whoops. Let me fix that. Give me 1 second. Easel problems. Sorry, give me a second. I need to rearrange things here. Okay, back to where I was. Okay, so I'm gonna block in that's not quite right, but that is not an important part of the painting. It's the right value. The color's not exactly right. And I actually, if I were working on this painting, if I were doing this just on my own, I may struggle to get just that right color. You're looking at the photograph, you're not going to be able to tell the difference I mean, but when I look at my color that I'm putting down, it's more of a sort of battleship gray, where the color I'm looking at is a much more subtle grayish blue, kind of warm gray blue. And I may, if I were working on this painting on my own, I may struggle with that just because I think it's a really beautiful, subtle color. But since it's not important to what we're really working on in this still life, I'm not going to waste time on it. I'm not going to waste your time on it. But it's, I may work on that if it were just me here. So one thing I will do here is I will again put in the occlusion shadow or start to indicate it, just so we get a sense of this being a fabric that's resting on a tabletop. So I'm just using a little bit of black just to indicate that little sliver of shadow.
It almost looks lighter though in the photograph.
What almost looks lighter?
Like where you're putting a shadow almost looks like there might be a highlight instead.
Well, there's not, you mean like right here?
Not like a highlight, but yeah, yes.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, what do you think that is? Any guess as to what's happening there? And that's actually part of what makes this a really subtle, beautiful, warm color. Like, why does the tabletop get a little bit lighter right here? So, like, based on what we've talked about in terms of reflection.
I don't think it's the tabletop. I think it's the very thin flat edge of the towel.
Oh, the thin flat edge of the towel, yeah, that definitely gets lighter. So the towel or the napkin has a minimal thickness, right? So there is actually like a little tiny plane that's picking up light. That's for sure. I mean, that's such a small detail. I'm not going to put that in right now. For me, what's more important is the occlusion shadow underneath the drapery. But there is a little thickness there. And I guess I would put that in if I were to bring this painting to a real completion. But I would do that much later. Whoops. But more what I thought you were talking about was I don't know if you can see in the photograph, but very subtly, the paper itself gets a little bit lighter and a little bit warmer right here. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Does that not show up in the photograph?
No, you can see it. It almost looks like blue-green. I mean, the whole bottom looks kind of like a bluish green tone, to be honest.
Well, what's happening actually is there's a very subtle reflection of the orange. but again, that may be a little bit too subtle to pick up in the photograph. So, but you know, since you brought up the detail of the little edge of the fabric, now again, that's a small detail that I would not spend time on right now. But sometimes things like that, sometimes it's not a bad idea to indicate certain very carefully chosen details as a way of establishing, with just a few little marks, you know, a kind of particularity of what you're looking at. So we could maybe take, you know, this brush and just like subtly chisel in that little plane. And we could do it in a kind of broken way to suggest the way that sometimes happens on fabric. You can start in subtle ways without having to get too wrapped up in very fine detail. You can just start to suggest the specificity of what we're looking at. I'm going to cut back into that a little bit so it's not too strong. But sometimes things like that aren't a bad idea. I mean, if you hadn't brought it up, I wouldn't have noticed it right now. Okay. So back to the large masses. So okay, so I would normally ask you all about the value distinctions on the drapery. But I can just see that on my screen, like the value distinctions are much more extreme than in my painting. So I'll just say at this point, I've got the background blocked. Now I'm going to step back and look at value relationships. How are my value relationships working? Can anything get lighter? Can anything get darker? So at this point, my darks can definitely get darker just based on what I'm looking at. I don't know if maybe you can see that a little bit when you make that comparison. So if you, I think you can see on the screen that these darks, that the darks up there are darker than these. So I think I need to make that adjustment. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to go back to my dark mixture. Now my dark mixture, which is ultramarine blue and yellow ochre to make a dark green, that's about as dark as I can get without getting too blue. So given the colors we have, can anyone want to hazard a guess as to how I can make this darker, but not let it get too cold? Given the colors we have.
You'd add red.
What did you say?
Could add red.
Add red. Who said that?
Dvora.
Devora, why add red?
Because it looks like that would darken it, but also keep it from getting too cold.
Okay, so that's a good, I mean, that's definitely good reasoning. Yeah, I'm going to try adding a little red. The other reason we could add a little bit of red has to do with the color wheel. So if we think about the color wheel, so we have red, yellow, blue as our primaries. when I mix, so these are our primaries. When I mix yellow with blue, I get green. And green goes right here on, green goes right here on the color wheel. On the color wheel, green is directly across from red. So what does that mean green is? What do we call green and red in relationship to each other? Does anyone know?
Are they complementary?
They're complementary colors, right? So complementary colors on the color wheel. So a complementary color is a color that's directly across the color wheel from another color. And in theory, at least, if we mix complementary colors, we can darken each color while maintaining a certain richness, a certain color richness. So often a way to darken green, not always, but often you can use a color opposite. So I'm going to try darkening that with some of my transparent red oxide. Let's see what happens. I'm not going to use a lot of it. I'll mix up a bigger puddle of this dark green. Then I'm going to just put a little bit of that transparent red oxide in there. And it actually does a beautiful job of darkening that green, keeping a really rich, dark green that is still warm. So now I'm going to go in and alter my greens. I need to turn my easel a little bit so I can just see it a little better. And I'm going to darken my greens. At the same time, I'm going to start redrawing a little bit. I can use that darker green for something of the cast shadow. Excuse me, the core of the shadow. And I can leave some of the lighter green for the very subtle reflected light in there. So I'm going to use that darker green. And in this case, that transparent red oxide with the green we mixed up with ultramarine blue and yellow ochre works really nicely to get that darker, richer green that I think we need. Just going to scrub that edge, that shadow edge a little bit to start getting that turning form. So in terms of blending, like I often do this kind of thing where I'll just sort of nudge those two tones together at the edge. So I haven't even used the dry brush. I'm starting to turn that edge a little bit. I'll do the same thing here on the edge where the form shadow turns into cast shadow, and then the form rolls back towards the light. And I'm putting in those strokes I referred to in that slide lecture as these little strokes I'm going to stitch in. And then I'm going to go down with the brush I'm using and merge those together. And right now, I'm barely touching the surface of the painting with the bristles of the brush. Barely touching it. I'm just sort of like nudging those areas of tone together. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that I was going to simplify everything from here over to the dark, the dark on the furthest right-hand part of the painting. So there's a kind of tube or form of light here that is distinct, or there should be, that's distinct from the deep crevice of the drapery here. So I'm now going to make that distinction. And I think I can make that distinction most easily by slightly darkening this here. So I'm going to take my shadow color and I'm going to mix that wet into wet into the paint I already have. Okay. Now that I put a little bit of that paint down, I'm going to reconsider that. I'm going to reconsider that because I see, when I look at this color here, I see that it's making a little bit too gray of a darker color. So this that deep point on the drapery that should be there is darker than that tube-like form here, and it's darker than this plane on the drapery. But when I mixed in the shadow color I have, that's getting a little bit too gray. So I'm going to mix up, and it's getting a little bit too gray because there's some of that red in it, which is going to gray down the green. So instead of using that red, instead of using that shadow color I mixed with the red, I'm going to mix up another dark green, just using the yellow ochre and the ultramarine blue. And I'm just going to add that slightly darker tone, that slightly darker half tone behind, that darker half tone in the crevice of the drapery. So again, once I have big areas down, the big masses of lights and shadows, I can relatively easily go in and change, make those lighter and darker areas a little bit lighter or a little bit darker if necessary. And do that within those big simplified values I've already put down. So now that I have that down, I do think I need to make this light plane, now this light plane that has re-emerged, I do think I need to make that a little bit lighter. Especially some relatively intense light where the form of that drapery, the kind of tube-like form of the drapery approaches the bottom part of the still life, creates a kind of little, inverted triangular-like shape, a kind of funnel shape. So I think that my shadows still need to get darker. I'm going to go into them, make them darker. Particularly that there's a little bit of cast shadow where this form, this round cone-like form, meets this back plane of the deep crevice of the drapery. This tubular form is casting a shadow on that back plane of the drapery, and it's creating a little bit of a helping create a little bit of a reflected light. Indicate that. Again, this is all fairly rough. I'm going to soften those two tones together. Okay, so here on the drapery, I think there can be a little bit of a halftone to turn this shadow into this light. So I'm going to mix a bluer middle tone. Because again, I see that halftone as being slightly blue, slightly bluish. Put that tone in, just so that shadow, again, so I maintain the clarity of the shadow, but that shadow mask rolls around nicely into the light side, into the white.
Professor, when I bend like that, my painting got messy. I don't know why.
You know, I think the only thing I can say about that is you just have to develop, you just have to keep practicing it. I mean, I don't think there's any secret other than that. I wish I could give I wish I could offer an easier, kind of like secrets that I could just communicate verbally. But I think if you're interested in that kind of blending, it's just a kind of practice you have to do. So I should move on to the orange, but I do want to just clarify here a little bit. I could clarify and develop this form on the drapery more. I see just based on my drawing, I should have left more room for the shadow pattern on that form. I won't spend a lot of time on it though, because I want to move on to the orange before we run out of time. But I do see that my shadow pattern on that form should come in further. So I'm going to wipe out some of the wet paint that's there. And I will go in and indicate some of that shadow pattern. So that shadow pattern, it takes the shape of a kind of, it's a kind of inverted triangle, or it looks a little bit to me like one of those, what do they call them, a bait, like a turkey baster? Is that what they're called? Or that thing you cook with where you has that shape to it. So the shadow pattern on this is all the way down like that. I have to redraw that too. All right, give me 1 second. I want to plug my phone into a charger so we don't lose my phone.
You're gonna break it off in 2 parts and send the video, right? Professor?
Yes.
You're gonna break up the video into 2 parts and upload it, right?
Well, I'm filming it at a much lower resolution than I did last week. That's the only option. So I don't think this will be interrupted by my phone overheating again.
You paused, remember, with the whole.
Yes, I will upload it in 2 parts, yes. Yeah. Okay, so let me, we're getting near the end of class anyway, so I hope let me at least start the block in of the orange. So I'm going to start with the shadow mask on the orange, as I typically try to do. So that shadow mask is a Okay. Well, I got much further than I did before.
When you're recording,
My phone just overheated. Linseed oil is generally the oil that oil paint is mixed with. So what oil paint is dry pigment ground into linseed oil. So if you add more linseed oil to your paint is going to take much longer to dry. So
Okay.
that's something you should just be aware of. You can do it, but you need to do it very consistently. So you don't want to do it like on some days, but not on others. If you do it consistently, then you can do it, but your painting's going to stay wet for a long time. That's just a preference. If you want, I don't know if you remember, I sent you the ingredients to make a medium, and one of those ingredients was linseed oil.
Yeah.
So that mixture, part linseed oil, part mineral spirits, and part, what do they call it? Well, either liquid or GAM. I'm forgetting the product name right now. That doesn't make the oil paint dry so slowly, but does some of the same things. So I can go over that if anyone's interested in that immediately.
So what exactly are the benefits to it on drying slower? Does it make the paint more fluid and easier to like manipulate and blend, or like what?
Yes, it can make the paint more fluid, easier to manipulate for certain techniques. And I don't know if you've noticed, but when you make an oil paint and you're looking at it on the day you're painting it, it looks very vibrant and fresh. But the next day or a couple days later after it's dried, it looks a little bit chalky. And if you mix linseed oil or medium into the paint, you can help prevent that chalkiness. So that's another reason artists use it.
So does it kind of like add like a glossy sheen to when it dries? Okay, all right.
Yep. You do have to use it with care, because if you use it in a way, if you use it the wrong way, then your painting can peel and crack. But if you use it the right way, it should be fine. So I'll actually talk about that one day, since you're asking about it.
I don't know. I was just curious because I see it, there has a product in this, where the paints are. And I've wondered if it's something that we can try to, explore, but I wasn't sure if you recommended it.
What I'm doing, as I'm working on my painting, I use this medium. This is a mixture of linseed oil. Did I freeze? This is a mixture of linseed oil, mineral spirits, and something called liquid. I can talk about mixing this up and how to use it. I just dip my brush into it as I'm working.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we should be back. So I'm mixing the shadow color for the orange, which is a dark, really the way I would describe that color is a dark orange. And I think it's a color something like this. So I think I can get that color just by mixing transparent red oxide and yellow ochre. But let's see. Maybe I'm going to need to make it a little bit lighter. So I want to emphasize something right now. What I'm paying most attention to as I'm judging whether this is the right color is not the color itself. Like, I'm not just looking at that color. Instead, I'm looking at this color and how it relates to my green. that I've already put down, because I think that green is pretty accurate. I think that green is doing a good enough job at this stage of the painting to suggest the green that I'm looking at. So the only thing I'm interested in judging the color of the shadow side of the orange is how it relates to the green I've already put down on the canvas. And so I'm making that comparison. So how does my orange appear relative to that green? So I'm going to block in that shadow side. And I'm not looking at this color here. Instead, I'm looking at these two colors together. And that's how I'm making that decision. How does the orange I just put down relate to the green in terms of value? Like it should be a lighter value than the green, and it's doing that. It should obviously be a warmer color than the green. And it's obviously doing that. The question is more how warm should it be compared to the green? And I think that my color is a little bit too warm. So just looking at that orange and comparing it to the green, So the question is what to do right now. Now, I could leave this orange because I know it's not quite accurate. It's a little bit too fiery. It's a little bit too much of a pure orange for that color of the shadow. On the other hand, I do think sometimes it's useful to err on the side of color intensity when we're talking about the shadows, because it's so easy to make the mistake of making a shadow dark, but making it too dull and gray. So I'm going to decide what to do with this after I get the light side of the orange in. Because I also just kind of like it. I kind of think it looks kind of good with those other colors. So let's see what happens. So now I'm going to mix up the light mass of the orange. So now here, I was talking about this limited palette and whether or not I'd be able to get that green with the limited palette. We did a pretty good job on that. We may have a problem getting that vibrant orange. So let's see what we're able to do. We're going to have to add a little bit of white to that orange in order to get the right value. So we may have to sacrifice, given this limited palette, we may have no choice but to sacrifice some of the color intensity of the light side of that orange. So let's see. So I want to make sure that the value of my orange is lighter than the values around it. So that orange, and I think this is clear in the photograph, that orange needs to be much lighter than the green, the dark greens and grays around it. So that's the most important thing for me, making sure I get the color intent, the lightness of that value. So I am not able to get, just with the limited colors I have, I am not able to get that very intense yellowish orange, which is what the color of that skin is. Now there is a trick available to us that I can use once this painting is dry. I'll maybe talk about that. But for now, this is as orange as we're going to get. Okay, so now I'm going to look for those halftones. So the halftones are, okay, so those halftones are definitely, that they are slightly cooler and slightly darker than the lights. So I'm going to just take, I'm going to darken my light tone a little bit and add a little bit of blue. And I think it needs a little bit more blue. And as I'm putting in that halftone, I'll start to redraw the shadow. So just trying to discern where the halftones end and the full light or the center light begins. So something like that, I think.
Professor, I have a question. Are you using just a brush that doesn't have anything on it, or does it have the mineral spirits
No,
on
it has a little. No, it has a little bit of. Did you ask about mineral spirits?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've thinned the paint a little bit with mineral spirits, but also that medium I was talking about a few minutes ago.
Okay.
And as I said, I was talking to I think it was Lena I think we might still have been on break, but I'm using a little bit of medium to thin my paint. And I'll introduce medium to people maybe the next time we meet as a class.
So, Professor, for this painting, you're saying, well, you're using natural light from the window rather than the concentrated.
Yes.
Yeah. So, is that something you want us to try to do this time around? To try to do it with the natural light, since it's a different effect.
Not necessarily, because you need a north light window. That's the only light that will work. In other words, the window has to be facing true north, so that you never get direct sunlight coming in. If you have a window like that, then that's totally fine. I just wanted to do it just to show you an option. Like the lighting you use certainly doesn't always have to be that stark light coming from a clip-on light. You know, there are other subtle options that can work also, as long as you're thinking about the light and shadow in a very controlled way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So if we have that available, then that's something nice to try to to observe. But if not, then we can stick to the clip-on light.
Clip-on light, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Working with window light is also a little bit trickier because the shadows are a little bit more subtle. So I always like to start off talking about light and shadow with the clarity of a clip-on light, or clarity of a clip-on light. So as I'm painting the top of the orange, I'm basically looking at small patterns of light and shadow as those small forms turn towards the light and then turn away from the light. It's basically just a small light and shadow situation.
Especially on the drapery. I feel like on the drapery, the light, the natural lighting that's coming in from the windows is creating like a softer gradient, the shadow. Like it's a softer contrast between the highlights and the shadows. So I mean, I noticed a difference in the way that the light looks in this still life as opposed to last week's from Fridays when you were doing the other fruit.
Yeah, when you're using the clip-on light, it has a kind of like harsh, artificial light, where this appears more natural. I actually think it's a little bit more beautiful.
Yeah, I was really admiring the way that the shadows and the highlights look in the drapery right now.
So we're getting towards the end of class. I may run out of juice any minute now. I want to try to. For some reason, my Mophie isn't working to charge my phone. Let me just do this one more time. Oh, wait, I know that. I'm a technology disaster, aren't I? I apologize for that.
That's funny.
It's good. I'm a total disaster when it comes to technology.
I feel the same.
Okay, now my phone's charging at least. Okay, so we won't run out of that. Okay, so I should be able to go. I'm willing to go a little bit late if anyone wants to stay. But if people aren't going to stay, just let me know. But I can work on this a little while after. Does anyone want me to, or should we just end at 10 of 1? Don't worry about saying no. You want to end.
Well, I have a class at 1, so
Okay.
I
So we'll
can't really.
end. I'll try to very quickly. So one thing, now that I have this blocked in, okay, so it's very clear to me that my limited palette is not going to allow me to get that really rich light color on the orange. When I don't look at my orange, this color isn't bad. I mean, you know, when no one sees the still life I'm working from, you know, people will just, I think of this as a kind of muted color still life. But as I'm painting, it's creating some challenges for me in terms of seeing other values. So one thing I do think I need to do is I need to darken the value of the shadows. So before I do that, I'm just refining some of these things, setting that to look a little bit more like a dimple. Okay. So I do think my shadow pattern needs to go a little bit darker. So I'm going to do the same set of steps I did in the PowerPoint demonstration of the Asian pear. So I'm going to go back in and adjust my shadow now. So I'm actually going to I think I do need to make a slightly darker and slightly cooler and grayer color for the shadow. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to start to refine my shadow shape with that darker color. I think it can still be a little bit bluer. And so near the top of the orange, there's a little bit more of a kind of bending triangle at the top of the shadow shape as it describes the form of the orange moving up towards the stem, and then all of this is a little bit cooler. That's a little bit too dark, so I'm going to lighten that a little bit. So I'm, in effect, bringing in a core of the shadow, or I'm starting the darkening of the orange with the core of the shadow. And that shadow sneaks under the orange. So the orange at the bottom where it turns under goes into shadow. I always want to see that shadow at the bottom of the form. And I'm going to merge that core of the shadow with the shadow mass a little bit more. that's helping me create a little bit more clarity for that shadow shape on the orange. And that shadow shape is just, it's still just a little bit too warm. Again, I could, in certain circumstances, I would keep that warmth. But I think because it's so warm, it's making the light side of the orange appear that much more dull in comparison. So I'm going to make my shadow mass on the orange a little bit duller, a little bit cooler. And it makes sense that that's a little bit of a cooler color, because what color is reflecting back into the orange, the shadow side of the orange?
Green.
Green. And so that the green is reflecting into the shadow side of the orange, cooling down that color of the orange. So it's still a warm color, but it's just not quite that fiery warm we had before. So I'm going to, well, first I'm going to just a little subtle, make that core of the shadow just a little bit more subtle. Okay, so now I'm going to look really carefully at what is the color of, again, the color of that halftone. What's the halftone color that turns that shadow into the light? And again, that's a cool color. The skin of the orange has some green in it. There's green pigment up there. That's not the coolness of the halftone. But what I want to do is just stitch in or lay in that halftone. That's just going to be a transitional color between the shadow and the light. So I am again, just as far as blending goes, I am again now just using the brush I was putting the paint on with, and I am just barely skating across the surface of the paint. So I'm just nudging those tones together. For me, it's a little bit early to go in with a dry brush. And I can do that a little bit. I haven't gotten the painting developed far enough along yet. Do that a bit. I'm going with the drawing brush. You know, for people who went to, I know Diana went, if anyone else went to Michael's and bought a fan brush, you might also just look for some inexpensive brush that's shaped something like this, a soft-haired, round brush. Get a couple of those. Those will be very helpful too. So again, I want to emphasize something. I am not able to get, with the colors I have, I'm not able to get the particular characteristics of the color of that orange. That we could do that with our next palette. But that doesn't mean, and you all may run into that difficulty too, that you're not able to get the particular color of something you choose to paint. So what we're going to do with this limited palette is use the paint we have to make as convincing a depiction of that color that you can. And that's all we can do right now. You know, and again, it's the type of thing where when people look at the painting outside of making reference to the object it's painted from, it will probably work very beautifully. So I would continue to develop the painting in the same way I talked about in that PowerPoint demo. The one thing I would put in now, I would start to indicate some of the highlights. So I see a very clear highlight.
Deborah's trying to get back into the Zoom.
So I see a very clear highlight here. And I'm always trying to paint the highlight so that it seems to, I don't want to paint the highlight that looks like it's floating above the surface. I want it to be clearly sitting on.
Professor, did you hear that Deborah's trying to get back into the room?
I just let Devora back here.
It's Devora, sorry.
Who else is trying to get in?
No, that was it. I didn't know if you heard me.
Yeah. So I'll put that highlight down and then I'll merge it into the paint around it. And so I'm going to have to end about here. We're at the end of class. But I would certainly keep working on this. You could, if anyone is interested enough, you could refer to that demo I did of the Asian pear, you know, because I would basically be doing the same steps as I continue refining this. You know, this is still in a somewhat early stage, but that's the basic approach I would take with this palette. Does anyone have any questions before we end for the day?
Professor, my black color, it has oil. When I try to paint with the black, so it is oily.
Your black paint is oily?
Yeah.
You mean when you squeeze it out, there's a lot of like extra oil that comes out?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so a very easy thing to do, take a piece of paper towel, fold it into fours, and then put the oil, squeeze the oil paint out onto the paper towel and let it sit there for about 5 minutes. And that paper towel will absorb all the extra oil.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
That happens with oil paint. It's not a problem with the paint, but I do that all the time.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
So what exactly is the assignment that we have to do?
Okay, so set up a simple still life with 2 or 3 objects. So it could be, you know, something like a piece of fruit and a drapery, but it really could be anything. I would keep the object relatively simple. So don't do something like, don't use a Coke can where you're going to have to paint the words Coke on it. You know, again, a piece of fruit, a drapery, a simple cup. Set up a very simple still life with 2 or 3 objects. Try to set up something you like that you think is attractive, and then do a painting of it, thinking carefully about value, color, temperature, and then trying to get as close as you can to the colors using this limited palette. So white, transparent red oxide, yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, and black. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
When is this due?
Okay, so you have tomorrow to work on it. And then on Wednesday, we're going to be doing another demonstration. But the painting won't be due until next Monday.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
So
you
we're
have-
starting. I'm
you
sorry.
have
We're
all
starting.
tomorrow to work on it. Tomorrow will be asynchronous. I'll be available as usual.
Okay.
And then we're going to be I'm going to be introducing another project on Wednesday. And then you'll have Thursday to work on that new project and all weekend to finish both.
And Professor, when you start painting one day, the next get into that. So it has like a chalky and I cannot blend the next day.
I'm sorry, Selena, I didn't understand.
So if you start painting one day and you do it the next day, you want to finish the next day. So it has like a chalky surface. You cannot blend the paint, like too much paint.
You mean because it's not dry enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, you might want to so if you work, so let's say you work on this painting tomorrow, you might want to wait to work on it again for a couple of days. Let it dry totally.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Have a good day, Professor.
Okay, you too. So tomorrow is asynchronous. I will see you all Wednesday morning.
Okay.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Professor.
Professor, since you are continuing, can I stay?
Oh, I'm not gonna, since most people aren't here, Melody, I'm not gonna keep painting today. Because I did tell my daughter I would try to get home.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, I appreciate your interest, but I feel like since most people won't be here, I should go home with my daughter.
Okay, okay.
Okay, thank you though.
Okay, have a good day.
You too.
Bye.